Gaul, an ancient land encompassing modern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and northern Italy. This enormous region was, to the Romans, a dark and mysterious land, occupied entirely by vicious and temperamental barbarians, quick to anger and deadly in combat. As far as the Romans were concerned, the inhabitants of Gaul were the archetypal uncouth barbarians. They drank wine undiluted, they wore trousers, and they had sacked the city of Rome in 390 BC, an outrageous transgression which burned bright in the Roman imagination for centuries. Whilst it is true that the Gauls did sack Rome and thoroughly enjoyed imbibing wine, there is far more to this Celtic people than just drinking and fighting. Although, as Asterix and Obelix taught us, they were rather good at these activities too. After all, Gallic tribes came to dominate this vast region, and bands of Gallic warriors, seeking riches, new lands in which to settle, and work as mercenaries, crossed the Alps into northern Italy, followed the Danube into the Carpathian Basin, and travelled down the Balkans into Greece, with some even making it as far as Anatolia. Beyond the Martial, the Gauls possessed a rich and varied culture, some of the wider Celtic elements of which survive to this day. Their artwork was sumptuous, wrought in gold, wood, and bronze. Their religion, enigmatic, defined by a reverence for the earth and dominated by a druidic class. They grew rich on the fruits of agriculture and the ever-increasing trade passing along the river valleys of Gaul. And their little understood language, slowly extinguished by Roman occupation, leaves us with myriad questions. Join me in this video as we explore this deeply captivating and oft caricatured people, denigrated by Romans and Greeks alike. In short, we will seek the answer to this question: who were the Gauls? Despite the fact that most of the written sources we have concerning the Gauls come from contemporary Greek or Roman sources, we must look much further back to the later Bronze Age, around the year 1300 BC, to discern the origins of the Celtic peoples we know by the name Gauls. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, the Minoan-Mycenaean civilization dominated the eastern Mediterranean, their economic and political importance largely predicated upon a network of trade which stretched far beyond the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The so-called Late Bronze Age collapse, an upheaval perhaps caused by climate change, overpopulation, or Europe-wide migrations, brought to an end this world order, destroying the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and Hittites, and laying low the mighty Neo-Assyrians and Egyptians. This collapse affected not only the Mediterranean world, but the northern peoples who had been linked to its shores by trade networks, breaking the old order and ushering in new ones. In the centre of Europe, a new broad culture developed, the Urnfield culture, primarily defined by shared burial practices, which involved the interring of cremated remains inside funerary urns located in dedicated cemeteries. Enjoying a relatively high level of social and economic stability in the centuries following 1300 BC, the Urnfield culture saw a population boom, an intensification of agriculture, and the rise of an elite whose power centred on hill forts. It is from the wider Urnfield culture that the Hallstatt culture developed in Central and Western Europe, from around the turn of the first millennium BC to the middle of that millennium, bringing with it more clearly delineated social distinctions based around an elite of chieftains and warriors. Warriors who were buried with their weaponry and riding tackle. Power became increasingly concentrated upon the Loire, the Rhône, the Seine, the Rhine, and the Danube, as Greek and Etruscan goods found their way northwards and into the hands of local elites. So far, we have traced the origins of the wider Celtic peoples. However, arguably the real moment at which the Gauls can first be glimpsed is during the mid-5th century BC. It was at this point, around the year 450 BC, that the Hallstatt culture underwent a dramatic transformation, to be replaced by the Latin culture, a culture which centred on Gaul. Whilst there was some degree of cultural continuity, such as the basis of society around a warrior elite, Latein differed from Hallstatt quite markedly. Warrior graves featured spears and swords, fighting weapons rather than the display weapons of the Hallstatt elite. Two-wheeled rather than four-wheeled chariots were favoured. The previously dominant Hallstatt hill forts were apparently abandoned or destroyed. And notably, Latein brought with it a distinctive Celtic art style. Intriguingly, the sites from which the Latein culture apparently grew were situated north of the Old Western Hallstatt cultural core. Cunliffe thinks that this may indicate a peripheral society, raiding, destabilising, and eventually superseding the Hallstatt culture. Indeed, the Celtic Migrations, as they are sometimes called, saw a great expansion of these Celtic peoples outwards from the centres of the Latin culture, around the Loire, the Marne, the Moselle, and Bohemia, westwards and southwards into modern France, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, and southern Germany. It was these migrating tribes, raiding warrior societies based around fighting elites, who would go on to become known as the Gauls. As we have seen, it was around the 5th to 4th century BC that the Gauls appear to have established themselves in what is now modern France and beyond. It was also during this time that they first enter the historical written record, as the marauding southward movements of Gallic tribes during the Celtic migrations brought them into close and often violent contact with the Etruscans, Greeks, and Romans. According to the Roman historian Livy, writing in the 1st century BC, the primary reason for this migration was overpopulation. In describing the Gallic king Ambigatus, Livy noted, "For Gaul, under his sway, grew so rich in corn and so populous that it seemed hardly possible to govern so great a multitude. The king, now old, wishing to relieve his kingdom of a burdensome throng, announced that he meant to send Bellovasus and Segovasus, his sister's 2 sons, 2 enterprising young men, to find such homes as the gods might assign to them by augury, and promised them that they should head as large a number of emigrants as they themselves desired, so that no tribe may be able to prevent their settlement." Further to this, Pliny suggested in his Natural History that the draw of fine products and agricultural riches precipitated the southern movement of the Gauls. The Gauls, imprisoned as they were by the Alps, first found a motive for overflowing into Italy from the circumstance of a Gallic citizen, who had lived in Rome because of his skill as a craftsman, and brought with him, when he came back, some dried figs and grapes, and some samples of oil and wine. Consequently, we may excuse them for having sought to obtain these things, even by means of war. Whilst the potential for riches and exotic products were no doubt a lure, particularly for a society for which foreign raiding was a regular occurrence, historians generally agree that overpopulation would have been the primary factor in precipitating the Celtic migrations and the movements of the Gauls. A rapidly increasing population would have certainly caused political instability in a society based around a warrior elite, and migration would have been a convenient outlet for aristocratic warriors seeking prestige and political power of their own. The exact dating of these southern movements is debated. Although the traditional dating of around 400 BC is generally accepted, more recent suggestions of an earlier wave of Celtic migrations in the 6th or 5th centuries BC have been posited. In the Latin heartlands, the archaeological record also supports a large-scale migration around the year 400 BC. The Marne region, which apparently maintained a steady population throughout the 5th century BC, displays a sudden population decline around the turn of the 4th century, a trend borne out in the Rhineland and at least partially in Bohemia. Whatever the exact dating, it appears that a large number of Gallic Celtic tribes crossed the Alps and settled in the Po Valley, defeating the resident Etruscans and establishing a number of settlements, including Mediolanum, modern Milan. Our archaeological evidence for Gallic settlement in the Po Valley is considerable, and we are even able to distinguish between some of the different tribal groups in some cases, who, according to our ancient sources, included the Libiki, the Cenomani, the Boii, the Lingones, and the Senones. These Gauls, who settled south of the Alps and who dwelt there for many centuries, would become known as Cisalpine Gauls. The region to the north of the Alps, Transalpine Gaul. Having rapidly established their presence in the Po Valley, the Gauls continued their southward incursions, most likely with the intention of raiding the verdant lands of their new Italian neighbours. It was at this point that they first came face to face with the Romans, who by the 390s BC were themselves expanding northwards, conquering the cities of the Etruscans. It was at the city of Clusium that the forces of the Gauls and the Romans met. The death of a Gallic warlord during negotiations between the two sides appears to have soured relations, and as a result the Gauls, hell-bent on revenge, marched on Rome itself. The Roman field army, routed by the Gauls in July 390 BC at the Allia River, a tributary of the Tiber, were helpless to act as the invaders sacked Rome, laying waste to the entire city, with the exception of the capital, whose defenders held the line. Months of prolonged siege wore on as the triumphant Gauls, demanding a tribute from the defeated Romans which was not forthcoming, held the beleaguered city. It was only the increasing number of Gallic losses to disease and the Roman agreement to pay a settlement of 1,000 pounds of gold which saw the Gauls once more retreat northwards. By 390 BC, the Gauls had burst onto the Mediterranean scene. Their sack of Rome was, in Roman eyes, an outrage which would colour Roman opinions of the Gauls for centuries. The Gallic reputation was set. These were unreasoning, unyielding barbarians, animals from beyond the Alps. It is important to remember this when we read Roman sources discussing the Gauls. As the 4th century BC consul Popilius Laenus supposedly said, "These are not civilized people who will become your ally when you have taken their city, but wild beasts whose blood we must shed or spill our own." As the Gauls north and south of the Alps were establishing their presence in the early 4th century BC, other migratory Celts were also moving southwards and eastwards. Whether they originated in the Gallic homelands or were an offshoot of the Gallic peoples moving southwards into the Po Valley, a number of Celtic peoples certainly appear to have migrated around the year 400 BC along the Danube and into the Carpathian Basin, into what is now modern Hungary, Austria, and Slovakia. Certainly by the mid-4th century, Celts are attested in the Balkans, primarily through archaeological records, and it seems likely that this is linked to the contemporary depopulation of settlements in the Rhineland. However, the Danube was not the greatest extent of the Celtic migrations. It was a group of Celts who had settled in Illyria in the early 4th century who expanded suddenly and violently into Greece some 100 years later, taking advantage of the political instability that followed the death of Alexander the Great. Raiding into Macedonia and Thrace in the 390s and 380s BC culminated in an enormous invasion in 279, led by a chieftain named Brenos. A chieftain who supposedly committed suicide when his force was defeated at the infamous Hot Gates of Thermopylae, where the invasion of the Persian king Xerxes had been accosted some 2 centuries earlier. A number of Celtic survivors made their way across the Bosphorus to fight in the employ of Nicomedes I of Bithynia, their descendants remaining in Asia Minor for centuries, coming to be known as Galatians. These distant cousins of the Gauls finally fell under the sway of the Romans in the 1st century BC. Their influence in Cisalpine Italy fully cemented by the 390 BC sack of Rome, the Gauls remained a constant threat to the burgeoning power of Rome, with Gallic troops making periodic and violent appearances in the historical record. Notably, the dictator of Syracuse, Dionysius, having established a colony at Ancona, regularly employed Gallic warriors in his armies, a band of whom even participated in the Spartan war against Thebes in 367 BC. Although the Gauls do not appear to have expanded further south in the late 4th and 3rd centuries BC, raiding was almost certainly a regular fact of life, and Gallic incursions into Roman territory were a constant strain on relations, despite a short-lived peace settlement with the Senones in 334 BC. In the early 3rd century, Roman expansion saw the defeat of the Senones in 284 BC, and the founding of a Roman settlement at Sena Gallica, and the following year, a combined Etruscan Gallic force was roundly beaten at the Battle of Lake Vadimo. An uneasy peace was to last between the Gauls and the Romans for some 45 years. By the late 3rd century BC, the Etruscans had been vanquished, and the Romans, fresh off victory in the First Punic War, turned their eyes northwards once again to Cisalpine Gaul. The Celtic migrations had brought with them a high point of Gallic power. The Gauls flourished, establishing their tribal societies and increasingly clashing with the Romans. In fact, so dire was the Gallic threat deemed to be, and so strong the memory of Rome's sack in 390, that it would lead Rome to launch a series of campaigns over the course of 2 centuries, which would see the might of Gaul's tribes permanently crushed. However, before we go any further, we should try to better understand the Gauls, their society, their religion, and their culture. Though we know little detail about the societal structure of the Gauls, we can say with some certainty that it was intensely hierarchical. Caesar's assertion that the only 2 significant classes in Gaul were druids and knights, whilst an oversimplification, does give some indication of how stratified Gallic society was. The druids, who we will cover in more detail in the religion section of this video, did not have to pay taxes, nor did they have to serve in tribal armies. They also held an important legal function, in that they were regularly called upon to act as judges in criminal cases, as well as civil cases involving property disputes and inheritance questions. The tribal elite, on the other hand, established and maintained their position through warfare, and through the support of large entourages. These complex social structures, apparently organised around the classic client-patron relationship, involved mutual benefit. An aristocrat would have men beneath him who owed him service, and upon whom he would bestow benefits in return, such as land, treasures, or social prestige. Large numbers of semi-free men and women, perhaps comparable to medieval bondsmen, would have made up vast sections of the population. This client-patron relationship, which apparently operated at all levels of society, also existed beyond individuals, and was a method for relating various tribes to one another. Greater, more powerful Gallic tribes would act as protectors of smaller tribes, shielding them from marauding enemies, whilst being able to call on their support in times of warfare, and likely extracting some form of tribute. Julius Caesar witnessed this system firsthand in his conquest of Gaul when he allied Rome to the prominent Aedui tribe. As a result, many smaller tribes flocked to form relationships with the Aedui, owing to their prestigious friendship with the Romans. The tribal politics of the Gauls therefore seems to have been rather fluid, a shifting patchwork of tribal alliances based around the largest and most powerful tribes. Such political relationships were usually sealed with the taking of hostages. However, these were not hostages in the modern sense, held against their will and under duress. Most often, hostages were the sons of tribal chieftains, and would dwell with their foster tribe, being hosted as guests. They would also be active in the social life of their foster tribe, serving them militarily and politically. In doing so, closer bonds between tribes would be forged, further entrenching alliances. Julius Caesar himself made regular use of hostage-taking in his conquest of Gaul. However, his usage of hostages was a little more utilitarian. For example, he is known to have executed the Aeduan chieftain Dumnorix when the latter refused to accompany the Roman general as a hostage on his campaign to Britain. Whilst the women of Gaul do not seem to have held political power in the way that Celtic women in Britain and Ireland seemed able to, they do appear to have held a more prominent position in society than Greek and Roman women. For example, Caesar asserted that upon marriage, an account was kept of the bride's dowry and the wealth that the husband brought to a marriage. Upon death, the total sum passed to the surviving spouse. It would also seem that Gallic women, in the eyes of the Romans, held an equally fearsome reputation to Gallic men. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century AD, stated that a whole troop of foreigners would not be able to withstand a single Gaul if he called his wife to his assistance, who is usually very strong and with blue eyes, especially when, swelling her neck, gnashing her teeth, and brandishing her sallow arms of enormous size, she begins to strike blows mingled with kicks, as if they were so many missiles sent from the string of a catapult. Several Roman sources appear to have associated the Gauls, and other Celts, with sexual promiscuity. Although their wives were comely, they have very little to do with them, but rage with lust in outlandish fashion for the embraces of males. And the most astonishing thing of all is that they feel no concern for their proper dignity, but prostitute to others without a qualm the flower of their bodies. It should be noted that such sources are symptomatic of Roman writing, which likely intended to denigrate the Gauls as wild barbarians. Rome's expansion northwards in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC had a notable influence on Gallic society, quite aside from the obvious military and economic consequences. With such a strong polity to the south, raiding as a means of accruing prestige was effectively reduced. Therefore, it seems that a system of conspicuous wealth distribution to one's clients became a crucial means by which Gallic leaders could gain and maintain political influence. The wealth and means for obtaining precious goods to be distributed was usually gained by controlling trade centres, settlements which Caesar referred to as oppida, making these settlements increasingly crucial to Gallic society. Feasting was a key element of Gallic culture, not only as a method of entertainment, but as a way of displaying social status. Feasts were almost like a stage play, the performance of which would affirm social hierarchies. For example, seating was ordered by an individual's prestige, with the most powerful and wealthy individuals occupying the central positions at a feast. Similarly, the carving of the meat at a feast was a loaded moment, as the juiciest portion, customarily the thigh, was served according to status. Feasts may well have been an occasion at which raids were planned, or at least proposed. No doubt such alcohol-soaked events would have been the perfect time to float the idea of a raid. And we know that the presence of bards, whilst ostensibly for the purposes of entertainment, had social meaning too. Patronised by wealthy elites, bards would compose songs to glorify their benefactors and denigrate their lord's detractors. As the ritual of a feast held such political meaning, upsetting the ordered workings of such an event could well have been a method for challenging the social order. According to Greek historian Posidonius, such a challenge would usually have ended in single combat. The feast also demonstrated other hallmarks of Gallic culture, namely the elite practice of gifting and distributing one's surplus wealth to one's followers. Such behaviour, in turn, greatly raised one's social prestige, whether these gifts came in the form of money, treasures, or food and drink. It also neatly encapsulates the emphasis on hospitality that could apparently be found throughout Gaul, and indeed amongst other Celtic cultures. It was customary to offer sustenance to a visitor before asking their business, a custom that unscrupulous Roman generals were able to take advantage of on occasion. Whilst it may be intended more as a comment on the perceived ill-discipline of the Gauls, Ammianus Marcellinus noted the love that they supposedly possessed for wine. The nation is fond of wine, and of several kinds of liquor which resemble wine, and many individuals of the lower orders, whose senses have become impaired by continual intoxication, run about in all directions at random. While Marcellinus does play into the noble savage stereotype associated with the Gauls when he branded them as very quarrelsome and of great pride and insolence, he did also, rather interestingly, note the importance which Gauls placed on personal hygiene. They are all exceedingly careful of cleanliness and neatness, nor in all the country, and most especially in Aquitania, could any man or woman, however poor, be seen either dirty or ragged. In fact, grooming did have an important place in Gallic culture, particularly for the aristocracy, for it seems that tribal elites grew long moustaches which covered their mouths. This may well have been in stark contrast to the general population, who would have been clean-shaven or have worn relatively short beards. Our sources on the armies of the Gauls, many of them derived from the 2nd century BC Greek historian Polybius and the 1st century BC Greek writer Posidonius, who actually travelled widely amongst Celtic peoples in Gaul, Spain and across the Alps, tended to present the Gauls as noble savages, a people untouched and untarnished by civilization. In a purely military sense, this image of noble savagery meant that Greek and Roman writers stressed the fierce and volatile nature of Gallic warriors, in comparison to the well-organized and highly disciplined armies of the Romans. Unlike the standing and increasingly professionalized armies of the later Roman Republic, Gallic armies were far more decentralized, generally raised on an ad hoc basis in order to fight specific campaigns, or to embark upon a raid into enemy territory. Gallic forces would have been highly localized and organized around local chieftains. When, on the occasion that the Gauls gathered themselves into larger tribal confederations, as they did at Alesia to oppose the Romans, organization could have no doubt been somewhat chaotic. Strabo noted that the whole race is war-mad and both high-spirited and quick for battle, although otherwise simple and not ill-mannered. And therefore, if roused, they come together all at once for the struggle, both openly and without circumspection, so that for those who wish to defeat them by stratagem, they become easy to deal with. As a warrior culture, martial prowess was highly prized within Gallic society. Like many contemporary tribal societies, regular warfare would have been the norm, in particular in the form of raiding, targeting neighbouring peoples in order to carry off goods and slaves. As Gaulish armies were irregular, each warrior was responsible for providing and maintaining his own equipment, leading to great variations. Richer warriors would have been equipped in a similar fashion to contemporary Roman troops, sporting a shield, mail shirt, and metal helmet, most usually along with a spear and long straight sword. Poorer warriors would have had to make do with simple padded armour, or perhaps no armour at all. Shields were generally large and constructed of wood, sometimes lined with leather. The archaeological record shows that helmets were often equipped with projecting decorations, which would have served to increase the stature of the wearer in battle. The Gundestrup cauldron displays warriors with boar-crested helmets. The Gauls certainly did make use of cavalry, although most fighting was carried out on foot. Chariots certainly existed amongst the Gauls too. However, a lack of mention of chariots in Caesar's campaigns in Gaul suggests that by the mid-1st century BC, chariots were no longer used in combat, their usage relegated primarily to the ceremonial. Amongst Celtic peoples in Britain, however, chariots continued to be used for fighting. Contemporary Celtic peoples, including the Gallic Gaisatae, were known to go into battle naked, a decision which may have had some sort of religious or spiritual meaning. Torques and gold rings were customarily worn too, both by unclothed and clothed warriors, statements of wealth and prestige. In the words of Polybius, very terrifying, too, were the appearance and gestures of the naked warriors in front, all in the prime of life and finely built men, and all in the leading companies richly adorned with gold torques and armlets. In battle, single combat between champions was the order of the day amongst the Gauls. Warriors and chieftains would challenge opponents and fight before the assembled armies. Only if such combats failed to resolve disputes would an all-out battle commence. As Diodorus Siculus noted, it is also their custom, when they are formed for battle, to step out in front of the line and to challenge the most valiant men from amongst their opponents to single combat, brandishing their weapons in front of them to terrify their adversaries. And when any man accepts the challenge to battle, they then break forth into song in praise of the valiant deeds of their ancestors, and in boast of their own high achievements, reviling all the while and belittling their opponent, and trying, in a word, by such talk to strip him of his bold spirit before the combat. assembled Gallic armies would precede battle with dances and war cries, and war trumpets, known as carnixes, would be blown, whose haunting notes, combined with the din of massed voices, would have struck fear into opponents. Such a display may also have had a religious function, being intended to call upon the gods to impart their favour. Building themselves into a frenzy, Gallic armies would generally attack in an all-out assault, without making use of reserves. Once the tide of battle turned against them, panicked routs would often ensue. For the members of a warrior culture, defeat was incredibly shameful, and many Gaulish chieftains are known to have committed suicide on such occasions. The Gauls possessed a primarily agricultural economy, with the majority of the population feeding themselves via farming. Gaul was an enormously verdant region, and a large variety of crops were cultivated by the ancient Gauls. Various wheats, barley, oat, and millet, which would primarily be baked into flatbreads or porridges, and also gruels. Vegetables were also a staple of the diet of the average Gaul. We have evidence, primarily from reliefs, that some Gallic tribes possessed a kind of harvesting machine known as a vallus, a sort of ox-drawn device which would cut the ears of ripe grain whilst leaving the straw behind. On the estates in the provinces of Gaul, very large frames fitted with teeth at the edge and carried on 2 wheels were driven through the corn by a team of oxen pushing from behind. The ears thus torn off fall into the frame. However, this contraption does not appear to have been widely used. Instead, scythes and sickles would have been a far more common harvesting implement. The Romans, upon conquering Gaul, brought with them a number of products, including figs, olives, and raisins. Animal fats and butter were common, although these were increasingly replaced by olive oil amongst the elite classes, particularly as the Roman period developed. Wine was also produced in Gaul, although the Gallic elite largely imported their wines from Italy. Animal husbandry was an important aspect of the Gallic economy too. Poultry was raised for both meat and eggs. Beef, pork, mutton and goat were commonly eaten, and these animals also provided important products such as leather and fat. Amongst these meats, pork and beef appear to have been the higher status, associated with the elite. Cattle in particular were linked with the aristocracy, especially the ownership of large herds, which were often the target of raiding by enemy tribes. Trade, particularly with the Mediterranean world, was common, although most products imported would have been by and for the consumption of rich elites. Many products were also exported to Italy, including foodstuffs such as grain, salt, and pork. Slaves were also sent southwards to the Romans to feed the demand for labour in Italy. Caesar's conquest of Gaul is thought to have potentially yielded hundreds of thousands of slaves. Trade only increased as Rome expanded northwards beyond the Alps, and following the Roman conquest of Gaul, as the province was drawn closer into the wider Roman economy, Gallic tribes on Rome's borders increasingly developed market economies. As mentioned earlier, wine was especially prized in Gaul. The Gallic practice of drinking wine undiluted shocked Roman authors. Diodorus Siculus rather nicely summarizes Roman views on the subject. Their desire makes them guzzle it, and when they get drunk they either fall into a stupor or become manic. For this reason, many Italian merchants, with their usual love of money, regard the Celtic passion for wine as a source of treasure. They transport the wine by boat on navigable rivers and by cart through the country, and get an incredibly good price for it. The oppida described by Julius Caesar generally designated as large settlements, which formed, in the words of Cunliffe, a focal centre in a larger territory, not necessarily that of the whole tribe. The oppida had a political legitimacy, and it may have been a place exercising regional authority. These oppida had an economic function too, and it may well be the case that it was these settlements which formed the basis of trade throughout Gaul. Known as Gaulish, the now extinct language of the Gauls was a Celtic tongue, and part of the wider group of continental Celtic languages spoken by peoples from modern Spain to Slovenia, and even as far as Turkey. These are generally recognised as Galatian, Lepontic, Hispano-Celtic, and Gaulish. Spoken in the area of Greater Gaul, there is evidence to suggest that Gaulish had a number of localised subdialects, although these are hard to reconstruct with much certainty. Indeed, it has been suggested that Lepontic, spoken on the southern side of the Alps, may have actually been a dialect of Gaulish. Of all the continental Celtic languages, Gaulish is the best attested, known from around 800 inscriptions found on pottery, monuments, coins, dedications, deeds, and curse tablets. However, despite this relative bounty of evidence in comparison to its continental brethren, our knowledge of Gaulish is still far too fragmentary for scholars to be able to reconstruct its features with any degree of confidence. In the words of James Fife, our knowledge of the great bulk of the grammatical features of any continental languages is too limited to make any reliable generalizations. That said, some scholars believe that Gaulish was a P-Celtic language, that is, derived from Proto-Celtic. P-Celtic languages, known as Brythonic languages, include Breton, Welsh, and Cornish, and are differentiated from Q-Celtic languages, known as Goidelic languages, including Irish and Scots Gaelic, by the rendering of the Proto-Celtic Q, P-Celtic rendering this sound as P and Q-Celtic as C. However, recent scholarship has stressed the view that these Celtic languages are part of a language continuum due to intensive contact between Celtic peoples, and that comparison with modern Celtic languages can only take one so far. Both the Greek and Latin scripts were used to write Gaulish. A passage from the Vita Sancti Symphoriani, a text detailing the life and martyrdom of Symphorian of Augusta Dunum in 178 AD, includes a Gaulish passage where the saint's mother cries out to him, Nate, nate, Symphorane, mento beto Judeo. Son, son, Symphorianus, think of your God. Inscriptions on spindle walls, seemingly given as gifts to women, contain a multitude of messages. One reads, Geneta imi, daga vimpi. I am a young girl, good and pretty. Gaulish continued to be spoken amongst the wider population of Gaul following the Gallic Wars and Rome's conquest of the region. As may be expected, Gaulish aristocrats rapidly adopted Latin in the 1st century BC in order to maintain their power and influence in their now Roman-dominated world. No doubt Latin increasingly came to be spoken throughout Gaul, particularly in urban areas where Roman power was most evident. However, for the rural populations and Gallic peasantry, Latin was not especially useful or important, and this ensured the survival of Gaulish throughout Roman rule. Scholarship generally holds that Gaulish was, rather ironically, truly replaced by Latin in the century following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Franks, whose kingdom rose from Roman ashes in Gaul, adopted language in imitation of the fallen empire, and the cultural shift away from urban power centres and into village-centred economics may explain the spread of Latin into the countryside. Whilst Gaulish is mostly thought to have died out in the 6th century AD, some scholars believe it may have endured in some regions as late as the 10th century. It is generally thought that the ancient Gauls were polytheists, worshipping many gods and goddesses. These deities were associated with locations, natural forces, and animals, amongst other things. Although belief in different deities appeared to vary across the dozens of tribal groups spread throughout Gaul, there were certainly some gods that were more universal. A father god associated with death and often held up as the tribal god and protector of the tribe was very common. Although identified by various names, Teutates is one name that appears often. Alongside the father god Teutates was a mother god, often known by the name Matrona, from whom the name of the river Marne came. Matrona was primarily linked to land, the earth, rivers, springs, and fertility, but in some renderings took on a more warlike aspect, being responsible for the protection of the tribe's land from its enemies. Taranis was a sky or celestial deity, closely linked with thunder. Isus, Lugus or Lugh, a pan-Celtic god responsible for crafts and knowledge, and Cernunnos, an antlered god who has been associated variously with fertility and the underworld. A rather fascinating theory suggests that in the 2nd millennium BC, there was a move away from solar and lunar-based religious systems in favour of a more earth-based belief system. This certainly seems to have been the case in Gaul, as worship of the gods often involved depositing votive offerings into religiously significant sites, such as rivers, bogs, and springs. Such sacred waters were apparently believed to possess healing qualities. Deep shafts or wells were also dug, apparently for the purpose of worship, often contained within delineated square boundaries, such as this example at Fellbach-Schmeiden, Baden-Württemberg. Within the waterlogged well shaft, wooden carvings of animals and human figures were discovered. Sacred groves were also important to the Gauls as natural shrines and sites of worship, many of which have yielded great numbers of votive offerings. As in most societies, in Gaul a priestly class existed to mediate the relationship between the general population and the divine, the oft-discussed Druids. Julius Caesar provides our most complete account of Gallic Druids, asserting that they had total control over all sacrifices. Furthermore, the Druids elected one of their number as the supreme leader of the Druidic class, a position which was reportedly held for life. This leader would convene a yearly gathering of the Druids within the territory of the Carnutes tribe, deemed to be in the very centre of Gaul. Caesar noted that the perks of belonging to the Druidic class included exemption from tax and military service, elements which apparently attracted many young men to the profession. We are told that a 20-year period of study was required to attain the rank of Druid, a study which primarily involved committing the Druidic doctrine to memory, the Gauls having no written holy texts. Intriguingly, Caesar also seems to imply that the hotbed of Druidic learning was actually in Britain, and that many students travelled there to study the doctrine. It has been suggested that this is evidence to support the idea that Druidism originated in the British Isles. Certainly, the Isle of Anglesey off the coast of Wales was a centre of Druidic worship by the time of Tacitus's account of the invasion of the island in 59 AD. In any case, it is not difficult to imagine the political influences wielded by Gallic Druids. It is perhaps not surprising that the Gallic rebellion which erupted in 53 BC began amongst the Carnutes, in whose territory the annual Druidic gathering was held. Sacrifice was certainly a crucial part of religion in Gaul, as it was amongst the religions of most contemporary peoples. Offerings in the form of goods, commodities, and spoils won in warfare were dedicated to the gods, and blood sacrifices were also offered up. However, the Gauls apparently differed quite markedly from the Romans in the practice of human sacrifice, which Roman sources describe with horror. The archaeological evidence to support Gallic human sacrifice is rather more scarce and inconclusive. It could be the case that Roman claims of this practice amongst the Gauls were much exaggerated in order to justify military action. According to several sources, the Gauls believed in some kind of reincarnation. The principal doctrine they attempt to impart is that souls do not die after death, but cross from one person to another. Because the fear of death is thereby set aside, they consider this as a strong inducement to physical courage. The dead were generally cremated by the Gauls, and burials involved committing valuable goods to the ground: weapons, armour, and artistic works, all objects which were simultaneously intended to accompany the dead on their journey and to be a statement of their power and wealth in life. The heads of the dead held special significance to the Gauls, as they gained a rather gruesome reputation amongst Greek and Roman sources as headhunters. As Diodorus Siculus noted, they cut off the heads of enemies slain in battle and attached them to the necks of their horses. These blood-stained spoils they hand over to their attendants and carry off as booty, while striking up a paean and singing a song of victory, and they nail up these first fruits upon their houses, just as do those who lay low wild animals in certain kinds of hunting. They embalm in cedar oil the heads of the most distinguished enemies and preserve them carefully in a chest and display them with pride to strangers. Evidently, the taking of heads had a dual function. In a warrior culture, such as the Gauls possessed, it was socially prestigious, as evidenced by the displaying of the heads of defeated enemies. However, it was also religious. In Celtic practice, possession of a head was believed to imbue the possessor with the power of the dead person, presumably bringing them good luck, prosperity, and greater ability. Once a head was taken, losing it would be seen as bad luck, and the power of the severed head may begin to work against its former owner. It should be noted that following the Roman conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BC, and the absorption of the region as a Roman province, Gallic religion underwent a process of acculturation, leading to a localized fusion of Gallic, Roman, and Hellenistic traditions, deities, and practices, giving rise to what is termed Gallo-Roman religion. This fascinating merging of religious practices, which slowly gained precedence over native Gallic faith, deserves examination in its own right. The earliest examples of Gallic art, from around the 5th century BC, display many Mediterranean and Eastern influences, such as the copper alloy flagons found at Bas-Yutz in northern France, which evidently owe inspiration to Etruscan and Greek forms, but also demonstrate developments which heralded the wane of the old Hallstatt elite and the ushering in of the Latin culture. As Cunliffe points out, Etruscan vessel forms are mutating, and already Greek palmettes and lotuses are disintegrating into more loosely structured plant forms. It has been suggested that Gaulish tribes in the Cisalpine regions, such as the Boii and the Senones, were the groups to first integrate Greek and Italic artistic styles within the existing Celtic ones, and to transmit these styles northwards into Gaul. As Gaulish art developed, this shift away from the more linear and geometric forms of decoration that characterized Hallstatt art can be seen, to be increasingly replaced by leafy patterns, plant motifs, vines, spirals, and S-shapes, all reminiscent of foliage. However, patterns and designs were not simply limited to greenery and plant-based forms. Beasts, both fabulous and mundane, as well as human forms, can be found on artworks from Gaul. This complex interweaving of human, animal, and plant motifs is a pattern which developed into a hallmark of wider Celtic art. Metalworking in gold and bronze was an established practice by the Iron Age, and craftsmen from Gaul were adept in its use. Openwork discs demonstrate the skill with which bronze was carefully worked into thin sheets before elaborate patterns were inscribed or else hammered into the reverse side, a technique known as repoussé. A wide array of golden neck and arm rings have been found across Gaul, and helmets, such as this example from Agri in France, not only display the astounding skill with which Gallic metalworkers practiced their craft, but are also excellent examples of the so-called vegetal style, with vine-like tendrils tracing delicate patterns across the surface. Eastern influences do appear to have continued to affect Gallic art. The 1st and 2nd century BC Gundestrup cauldron, a fascinating artifact in its own right for the depiction of warriors on its sides, is notable for this reason, for although the figures are decidedly Celtic, the use of silver as a material and the gilding is rather more Thracian. It may well represent the work of a Thracian artist living amongst Celtic peoples. Whilst much of the work produced by ironsmiths and bronzesmiths would have been primarily practical, decorative artistic flair is still on display. Gallic carnixes, a Celtic war horn usually made of bronze, often terminate in the sculpted heads of animals. Scabbards are also a good example, often inscribed with not only patterns, but also with symbols, whose meaning is largely lost to us. Sculpture was a big part of Celtic art, but owing to the fact that most sculpture would have likely been produced medium of wood, a material notorious for rotting in wet climates, relatively few examples survive. The earliest known Gallic sculpture, dating from the 6th century, is a near life-size limestone carving of a warrior, complete with a torque and dagger. Smaller sculptures have also been found, and may well have had ritual religious functions, such as the stone head, complete with a moustache dating from the 2nd or 1st century BC, thought to be a deity. Sculpture was not purely human either. The so-called Tarasque of Nove depicts some sort of fearsome beast resting atop decapitated human heads. It has been theorized that the niche below this creature's head was intended as a place to store the decapitated heads of enemies. Pottery was also widespread as the Latin culture developed. Gallic pottery displayed very similar designs and patterns to those used by Gallic metalworkers. Black and red painted pottery was also produced. Quite astonishing is the work of a potter operating in Clermont-Ferrand in the 2nd century BC, whose experimental work features complex patterns interlaced with highly distorted animals. Such high-quality pieces must have been intended for local elites. Their fragility relative to metalwork would have prevented long-distance travel. Fresh off a victory in the First Punic Wars against the Carthaginians, the Romans turned their attention to the north of Italy. With the Etruscan cities firmly under Roman hegemony, the Gauls in the Po Valley became the target of Roman expansionism. In 232 BC, the Senones, who had often launched raids against Roman lands during the 3rd century, had their territory conquered and confiscated by the Romans. Alarmed by this sudden action, the Cisalpine Boii, Insubres, and Tauriski tribes, aided by the Gaisatae from beyond the Alps, launched a combined assault in 225 BC with the intention of sacking Rome once more. This time, Rome was more prepared. On the Tyrrhenian coast near Telamon, 2 Roman armies met the combined Gallic host. Polybius noted that the Gauls brought some 50,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. Although it may be an exaggeration, this account gives an indication of the scale of the campaign. Polybius described the Gauls thus: "Their wagons and chariots they stationed at the extremity of either wing, and collected their booty on one of the neighbouring hills with a protecting force round it. The Insubres and Boii wore their trousers and light cloaks, but the Gaisatae had discarded these garments owing to their proud confidence in themselves and stood naked, with nothing but their arms in front of the whole army, thinking that thus they would be more efficient, as some of the ground was overgrown with brambles." The battle was a resounding defeat for the Gauls, with Polybius reporting 40,000 Gallic casualties. Even more crucially, this Roman victory appears to have severely weakened the Gallic tribes in the Cisalpine region, leaving them extremely vulnerable to Roman advances. Campaigns were waged against the Boii in 224 and the Insubres in 222, and in 218 2 colonies, Placentia and Cremona, were founded amongst the friendly Cenomani, who had not joined the 225 BC alliance against Rome. This Romanization of Cisalpine Gaul continued apace following the Second Punic War, which saw the Carthaginian invasion of Italy under Hannibal fail. In fact, the Second Punic War was something of a turning point. The Roman strategic gaze was, perhaps for the first time, fully fixed beyond the Italian peninsula. The vast riches of Carthaginian Spain were made apparent, and the strategic importance of the Po Valley was even more clearly realized. It was to this latter region that Roman attention again turned, and the valley was fully subjugated during the early 2nd century BC. Roman hegemony was established over the region through a mixture of political maneuvering and military might. A peace was struck with the Cenomani in 197 BC. Como in Insubrian territory was taken in 196, and in 189 the colony of Bononia was founded, in territory where the Boii had previously been dominant, launching thousands of Boii on northwards migration back beyond the Alps. In swift order, the Romans had broken Cisalpine Gallic power and established control over the Po Valley, bringing the boundaries of their republic up to the foothills of the mighty Alps. After a near 50-year period of relative peace, in which economic relations between Gauls and Romans intensified, tensions boiled over into conflict in the 120s BC. Roman campaigns against the Ligurians, the Celto-Ligurian Saluvi, and the Gallic Vaconti tribe in 124 and 123 BC saw the coastal regions of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul fall, and in 122 and 121 BC the Allobroges and the Arverni tribes were routed, establishing Roman control over the Rhone Valley up to the shores of Lake Geneva. To the west, further lands fell to the Romans in 106 BC, when consul Quintus Caepio was sent to put down a rebellion of the Gallic Volcae and Tectosages tribe, who dwelt north of the Pyrenees, sacking Toulouse in the process and completing the circuit of Roman Mediterranean coastal control, creating a land passageway from Hispania to Italy. This rapid and devastating expansion saw Roman power encroach beyond the Alps in a concrete sense, where previously it had only held a degree of political and economic influence. These new conquests became a new province known as Gallia Narbonensis, or Gaul of Narbonne, after the new colony of Narbonne. With such swift expansion came enormous economic opportunity, as these regions of Gaul were assimilated into the wider Roman Republic. Trade only intensified as it became ever easier to import Roman goods into Gaul and vice versa. These conquests created an incredibly rich axis of trade, north-south up the Rhone Valley and east-west from the Po to the Atlantic. The Gauls, now governed directly from Rome, did not remain entirely silent. We have various, perhaps unsurprising examples from throughout the first half of the 1st century BC of Gallic discontent with Roman rule. In 63 BC, the Allobroges sent envoys to Rome to complain of overzealous administration, and the great Roman statesman Cicero was himself involved in a legal battle from 75 to 73 BC in which he defended the praetor of Transalpina from charges which accused him of levying his own personal and completely illegal tax on the local Gallic population. It is easy to see how Roman administration in Gaul was heavy-handed, given Roman opinions on the inhabitants of this region. While the encroachment of the Romans in the south had seen vast tracts of Gaul conquered during the 2nd century BC, this was not the only threat facing the Gallic tribes. Other threats came from fellow barbarian peoples. Notably, one such challenge came from the north, from beyond the land of the Gauls. The Cimbri and the Teutons, two people whose origins aren't known for certain, but who migrated southwards from beyond the Rhine, likely from somewhere in the region of the Jutland Peninsula and modern Denmark. These relatively little-known peoples migrated into Noricum around 113 BC, before turning westwards into Gaul, pillaging as they went. They were finally defeated in 101 BC at the Battle of Vercellae by a force led by the consul Gaius Marius and proconsul Quintus Catulus. It was the movement into Gaul of another Germanic people, the Suebi, which was to precipitate the ending of the independence of Gaul. Led by Ariovistus, the Suebi invaded at the behest of the Gallic Sequani, in order to support them in their wars against the powerful Aedui tribe, who were allied to the Romans. This action likely took place sometime around 61 BC, and established Ariovistus as a powerful force in central Gaul. The invasion from beyond the Rhine aroused the ire of the governor of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, Julius Caesar. Caesar's interest in Gaul was multifaceted. It was a vast and fertile region with close economic ties to Rome, and the invasion of Ariovistus threatened this prosperous status quo. Even more importantly for Caesar, Gaul presented a prime opportunity to gain two of the crucial prerequisites for any successful Roman politician: military prestige from annexing territories for the Republic, and loot in order to pay off the debts one acquired in the process of accumulating said prestige. In 58 BC, Caesar struck, first defeating the Gallic Helvetii at the Battle of Bibracte, a tribe who had begun migrating southwards and westwards from their homelands in modern Switzerland. The Helvetii had actually avoided Roman lands altogether, and Caesar's attack could be interpreted as a somewhat unprovoked act of aggression. The Helvetii defeated, Caesar turned northwards, routing Ariovistus and his allies at the Battle of Vosges on the 14th of September 58 BC. These campaigns were the first acts in the Gallic Wars, a conflict which lasted until 50 BC. In these 8 short years, Caesar was able to subdue the entirety of Gaul, annexing these lands for Rome and increasing his political stock enormously. I would like to do a separate video covering the Gallic Wars in detail at some stage. For the time being, a short summary will have to suffice. In 57 BC, Caesar moved against the Belgic tribes, subjugating the Bellovaci, the Nervi, and the Aduatuci, whilst Publius Crassus, son of the triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus, campaigned along the Atlantic seaboard in the region of Armorica. The following year, Crassus's control of the region was challenged by a revolt amongst the local tribes, which was put down by Caesar in a reportedly brutal fashion. All the elders of the rebel Veneti tribe were executed, and every fighting man sold into slavery. Crassus himself was sent to quash unrest amongst the southern Aquitani, who may well have rebelled as a result of the interruption of their trade up the Atlantic seaboard, caused by Roman campaigns in Armorica. In 55 BC, likely in an attempt to gain propaganda victories which could ensure continued command in Gaul, Caesar briefly crossed the Rhine at the invitation of the Ubi tribe in a show of Roman strength, and even crossed the English Channel, landing on the southern coast of Britain. The relatively small Roman force achieved little, but Caesar returned with a much larger army in 54 BC, negotiating terms with the regional king Cassivellaunus before withdrawing back to Gaul. In Gaul itself, there was a reversal of Roman fortunes, when a force under generals Sabrinus and Cotta was routed by Belgic rebels, who had risen against Roman rule, perhaps exacerbated by poor harvests. This unrest spread across northern Gaul throughout 54 and 53 BC, and was only stymied by Caesar's systematic campaigning against the Nervi, the Senones, the Carnutes, and the Treveri. The Romans harried the civilian populations of these tribes if battle was not forthcoming. However, these actions had not ended Gallic resistance, as in 52 BC, perhaps precipitated by the annual conference of the Druids, the Carnutes began a rebellion which was the most serious faced by Caesar in Gaul. This unrest spread to the Averni, and a nobleman named Vercingetorix rose to become supreme rebel leader, raising all of central Gaul in open rebellion. Caesar responded by capturing the centralized settlements, or oppida, of the region, one by one. The campaign culminated in the infamous siege of Alesia. Vercingetorix's army, trapped in Alesia, surrendered to the Romans once the enormous Gallic relief force, estimated to number some 240,000 men by Roman authors, was defeated by Caesar. The winter of 52 BC and the campaigning season of 51 BC primarily saw the crushing of final pockets of resistance in Aquitania and amongst the Belgic tribes. These campaigns were typically brutal, and the tactics employed genocidal. In Caesar's commentary on the Gallic Wars, the actions against the Eburones, led by Ambiorix, are described thus. He had given up hope of bringing Ambiorix, who was a frightened fugitive, under his control, and he considered it the next best thing for his prestige to despoil his land of its citizens, buildings, and cattle. Caesar sent out legions or auxiliary forces to every part of Ambiorix's territory, and inflicted devastation by slaughter, fire, and pillage. Following Caesar's conquests, Gaul stood a ravaged land, racked by almost a decade of near-constant conflict. Of a population of an estimated 6 or 7 million people, it is thought that around 1 million perished and another 1 million were sold into slavery. It is not hard to imagine the bitter resentment which Gauls held for the Romans. Caesar was reportedly able to retain control of Gaul, not only by military might, but also through the giving of lavish gifts to Gallic leaders. Fresh off his triumphs in Gaul, Caesar was almost immediately preoccupied with the Roman Civil War, which erupted on the 10th or 11th of January 49 BC, as the victorious Julius famously crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome. In the decades that followed, Gaul remained relatively stable, aside from a brief revolt in Aquitania in 39 and 38 BC. Gallic society continued to be slowly transformed by close contact with Roman administration, as the oppida of the regions closest to the Mediterranean began, in the words of Cunliffe, to take on the appearance of a Roman town. The great wealth of Gaul was increasingly extracted through taxation, and gold flowed to Rome in great quantities. Once Augustus Caesar had established himself as emperor by 27 BC, campaigns were waged to bring the unconquered remnants of the Alps and Pyrenees firmly under Roman control, and further invasions of the Eastern Alps and Pannonia brought the last free Celtic peoples south of the Rhine into the Roman world by 7 BC. Augustus's organisation of a census of the whole of Gaul, primarily for the purposes of taxation, further accelerated the process of Romanization. The new emperor allowed, for the sake of expediency, local laws and customs to remain in place, which eased the assimilation of these new territories into the empire. The southern movement of Germanic peoples brought to an end elements of Gallic Celtic culture which had existed beyond the Rhine and the Danube. Under the Romans, elements of that same culture did certainly survive. However, Gaul underwent a period of intensive Romanization in the following decades and centuries, which saw the former culture of Gaul slowly fade. New Roman towns were established and old Gallic ones abandoned. The elite adopted many of the elements of prestigious Roman society, and Celtic names were given up in favour of Latin ones. Resentment at Caesar's atrocities must have remained long in the collective memory, and there was always the potential for localised unrest, particularly spurred by the abuses of Roman administrators. However, the increasing participation of Gallic elites in Roman society ensured that no major rebellions took place again. The political will to resist Rome simply did not exist by the end of the 1st century AD, when the integration of Gallic tribes into the Roman system appears to have been largely complete. Even in the furthest reaches of Gaul, in Armorica for example, each tribe possessed an urban centre clearly laid out upon a grid system in the Roman style. Some bastions of Gallic culture remained, such as the importance of religious sites, and there is some evidence for the continuation of Druidic tradition. That said, it is very difficult to see when and where distinctly Gallic practices waned. It seems certain that as the centuries wore on, Gaul's cultural heritage was largely lost, and although some elements were carried on by the Gallo-Romans, this once fiercely independent Celtic people increasingly faded into history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.